Dr. Karthikeyan Nachiyappan. He is an architect who has graduated from the Architectural Association. His research has been published in many esteemed journals, such as the Indian Concrete Journal. He is the founder and director of Studio of Architectural Urbanism, an art and architecture consultancy focusing on research and development of housing projects in Ooty and in Chennai. His research interests include low-cost housing, architectural space making, informality and slums, inequalities in planning, and policies and urban design.
Welcome to UGC lecture series on architecture, urban design. For your understanding and convenience, the theory has been composed into parts. Come, let's take a look at the contents today. So, it includes theories in urban spaces. So, we had looked at cities in the previous chapters. Now, for the cities to grow, there are certain theories which have been exhibited by major philosophers. So, we will be looking at those theories today. Starting from Gordon Cullen, who started looking at cities in terms of revolutions. So, Gordon Cullen told that urban experience is one of the series of revolutions with delight and interest being stimulated by contrasts. So, in simple words, he says that a city is composed of an experience. When a user walks by, he comes across a lot of series of spaces which makes him delighted or creates interest looking at different things. And this has been possible through the advent in technology to have more modes of transport. In simple words, the development of new modes of transport or travel has provided additional ways of seeing. So, the way we see or the movement speed decides on what we see. When walking, we would have a we would have a visual relation with the buildings or the people we see or we come across, but the experience is totally different when we go on a car, where the speed is much more different and what we see or what we capture again different. And that also differs from traveling on a bus, which is on an elevated level. So, the view composition changes. So, which means that when we move around a city is composed of parts which creates mental images within ourselves. These mental images are recorded. When that is recorded around a series of spaces, those mental images get around on different urban experiences as seen. So, it is with a different level of focus and it is seen at different speeds. So, Gordon Cullen considered that the urban environment should be designed in such a way that this from point of view from a moving person. So, any person moving from a street at the beginning should experience different urban spaces which radiates around the streetscape and creates different series and perceptions of views. Either he walks down, either he just moves by, or either just he cycles or he uses a car or moving in a bus. It should create different visual environments. That is the concept of serial vision. So, Gordon Cullen saw particular significance in tension between here-ness and there-ness. So, imagine this image where you get a perception of a space which is enclosed by a certain set of buildings which has limited elements of windows and doors, but from a viewpoint from here you could look at a road curving itself down the road, which creates a sense of experience or a surprise on what exactly would be there. So, this sense of here-ness and there-ness creates that tension is a resultant of serial vision. Looking at an example of a particular plan or a particular urban complex where a user is tend to move from the start point taking a series of arrow marks. So, looking at these arrow marks, so you could see how a user moves through and how the urban experience changes. The first image exploits where you are at the outer entrance, you could see this plan. So, this entire monolith building which has been fronted by a landscape or a tree, where the person around looks at a monolith building with series of breakdowns, but a pathway that invites him to move through this particular space. So, the first experience he gets is a monolith, but there is an entrance to move through. The second mental image he creates himself is when moving through that passage, the second entity, when he is over here, the scale grandiers, which means that in the previous image the scale is vast open, there is nothing above him, he could just see a building and he could see open sky above him. Now, the scale shrinks as he is in the place which is enclosed under a shadow, and the scale he perceives or see is much more grandeur. He could see a grand focal point which is dominating the skyline with a series of colonnades rounding the ground and series of buildings and windows fronting. So, now when he moves into the third place going on, so it is just right behind the monument, where he just gets a sense of a scale where he is perceived around the colonnades which is coming close to him, and a series of Venetian building elements and a monolith just placed in front of him. Now, the grandeur of this monument changes to a smaller scale close to him. Moving on to the next part of the place, where he envisions a path which is encompassed by two buildings on the side, and a person to walk by, is identifying a series of landscape elements to move through to experience the next space. Moving on to the fifth spot, where he comes across the cathedral, he looks at the beauty and the aesthetic part of the cathedral, where he is invited along a road to pass through to the next space, which is again dominated by a wall which is by a high rise building. Moving on to the next image. So, now he is encompassed around a particular space, where he again sees a monolith wall, but an inviting space which is pulling him outside. So, this trajectory of path pushes him outside to come to this point, where he could see a clustered courtyard and a funneled pathway, as you could see in the plan. Now, moving on to the next image, the last image, where he once exits out of that point, he could see a round colonnade which is represented by a kind of colosseum kind of structure, which has colonnades on all floors, and the scale expands as the viewpoint expands. Now, the ultimate imageability aspect in this entire vision is, from moving from point 1 till point 7, he experiences different urban visions. Even though the building or the urban form is kind of same, he tends of moves towards, a user is pulled towards a particular trajectory path to experience different visual forms, and those visual forms creates a series of extended images or mental visionary images within to experience the urban forms surrounded by him. Now comes the aspect of imageability and legibility, which was put down by Kevin Lynch, and Kevin Lynch was more focused on the quality of a physical objects, which gives an observer a strong or a vivid image. So, he believed that imageability is a concept which gives a strength of perception of a particular person or creates a kind of identity to that particular place. The highly imageable city would be well formed, would contain very distinct parts, and would instantly be recognizable to common inhabitant. Even today, when you had traveled to many cities, you would have come across the identical places. If it is Paris, it is Eiffel Tower. If it is London, it is the London Bridge. So, those are imageability aspect of cities, which creates identity to that particular nature, and other aspects of imageability could be attributed to 5 different elements that have been penned down by Kevin Lynch, which includes paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. So, a more focused image which creates a public image. As a whole, city is composed of different parts, but the entire city is seen as a single vision. So, whatever the place the city is composed of, whether it is good or bad, it is a series of spaces in an urban environment that is contained and the user to experience it. The definition of the path includes an interface of the person to move across different places. So, it is nothing but these are routes or channels which create a perception of an image from moving from one person to another. The continuity of the path depends on the width, gradient, and activity of it. An example of paths includes streets, walkways, transit lines, canals, and railroads, which connect something from another. Next comes the edges, which are nothing but the dividing lines. The red lines which you could see are not the roads. These are not the paths, but these mark the boundary or defense lines of the buildings or the blocks. So, these are otherwise the linear elements which creates a boundary between two different districts. Moving on to districts, these are areas which are perceived with internal homogeneity. There are certain urban districts which could be heterogeneous in nature with a lot of mixed use planning, but within a heterogeneous city there are districts which are completely residential, completely commercial. So, those are called as districts which have a sense of homogeneity in terms of use. So, most of the buildings would form a similar morphology. Most of it would have internal clustered courtyards that radiate around them, and most of the planographic implementation of the buildings or the scale of the buildings would be similar in a district. Next, coming to the nodes. Nodes are nothing but its junctions or focal points in a particular city. The node could be transportational in nature, or a node could be landmark in nature. It could be a passer thing, it could be a path, it could be a place where people conglomerate and agglomerate. So, center of attraction, in colloquial terms you could call it the center. So, these are the points or strategic spots in a particular city in which an observer can enter or be there. These nodes can simply be concentration points which gain their importance from being the condensation of some time. So, it has a physical character to it. It can be like a street corner, it can be like a square, it can be like a market, it can be like a temple. So, those are prominent features where a person or someone could identify themselves within a city. This moves on into the aspect of Kevin Lynch's mental maps. So, the processing of all these images or the visual experience of the user could be explained in terms of mental maps, which creates legibility. So, as you could see, this is a mental map of a prehistoric settlement, prehistoric map of bronze and iron ages. So, you could see a lot of settlements, so in the form of images. So, these are like a kid's drawing which are two dimensional in nature, but mental images creates a sense of roads, buildings. So, it has a two dimensional and a three dimensional juxtaposition of things working on at the same place. So, you could see animals, you could see human figures dancing out, playing, you could see animals being hunted, buildings, all the skylines. So, this is a mental image which clearly dictates what could have happened in a prehistoric image rather than drawing a map. So, which means that this image or the map has the legibility aspect for a user or a planner to understand what a city is. So, people understand the cities through recognizable elements. There are elements in a city or nodes or landmarks in a city out of which a city could be identified by any user. Mental mapping starts from a home and it increases in scale in terms of geographical location, home to a street, to a city, to a landscape or a region, and moving on into geographical or a part of nation. So, as we saw the first example of serial vision, so the user from the beginning till the end where he enters through a colonnade and exits through a colonnade, he had a series of mental images that are processed, and those are different visual experiences that are captured in the form of sketches, and that concept is called as serial vision by Gordon Cullen. And according to Kevin Lynch, the 5 elements which make up the city compose a city. In any city or the planning of a city, these elements are basic to be used upon. First being the paths, where the red lines which connect a district to another district, which forms a kind of an edge to a particular city, and it connects different nodes. So, these are movement related, or the nature of the path is to take one person from one place to another. And you could see districts which are otherwise called as central business districts, industrial areas, construction sites. So, all these districts are if it is an industrial area, it is homogeneous, it has more of industries. If it is a residential or a commercial area, it has predominantly commercial buildings. So, these are defined as districts. And coming to edges, like a canal way or a waterway which is being connected through different series of bridges. So, this canal is a permanent edge which segregates one district to another district. So, a roadway could be called as a path, and a canal way or a railroad could be called as an edge. Edge is where something ends and path is something which connects. So, that is the mild difference between path and an edge. Coming to node, you could see nodes are particular focal points through the map of a city, which could be prominent places of where people could meet, and this could be a religious place or this could be a commercial place as well, but a place well known by the locals as well as the tourists. And districts are particularly upon different characters. It has a homogeneous use and people use it for one major function. Landmark being dominating the cityscape, which means that any user from any part of a geographical location could identify what is the landmark in a particular city. So, these are distinct elements that dominate the skyline of the cityscape along any kind of landscape environment. So, these could be religious in character like a cathedral or churches, could be tall buildings, skyscrapers, commercial buildings. So, all these elements compose together to form what a city is, and these fragments of cities composed together forms a good living urban environment. So, this is a mental map of Boston, which was again done by Kevin Lynch, where this image has been considered as distinct elements or of collective in nature, including the paths, nodes, edges, landmarks and districts. When all these are composed together, the exact visual form of Boston is seen as different neighborhoods or districts clustered around different series of paths. Moving on to the next philosophy of Jane Jacobs, who was a social activist and a great urban philosopher in terms of getting the book called The Death and the Life of Great American Cities. She envisaged a good neighborhood. So, the terms like eye on the street, social capital was introduced by Jane Jacobs, where she was more talking about cities in terms of planning aspects more safer, planning aspects more utilizable, planning aspects more user friendly. So, she was against the planning concepts of post World War I American cities, which were growing rapidly in terms of suburbanization as well as motorization. Many vehicles came into existence. So, she just thrashed in her book The Death and Life of Great American Cities that the city planners are ravaging our cities. So, they are actually deconstructing or destroying the city's landscape in terms of building taller buildings, building highways. So, which means that she envisioned a proper city which are safe in nature for the people to move through. So, the legacy of her started with the more she investigated in terms of explored neighborhoods, infrastructure and business district for her stories, more she began to see the city as a living, breathing thing which is complex in nature, which is wondrous and self perpetuating. The legacy of hers was orthodox urban planning. So, she was quite famous in terms of getting eyes on the street concept. So, when more and more highways dominate a particular city, the walk friendly or the user friendly environment diminishes and your user does not feel safe. And she also argues in her book The Death and Life of Great American Cities that cities are more moved towards cars and not people, and she is also envisioning a city which is walkable. So, she has criticized certain concepts of urban planning which has been established by different other urban philosophers. To start with the urban concept of garden cities, which was realized in 1902 and 1919 in the cities of Welwyn and Letchworth by architect Sir Ebenezer Howard, where he proposed a conceptual diagram of combining a city and a countryside in the form of a garden city. So, garden city was a population for around 35 to 50,000, where inhabitants would emerge themselves in terms of a garden city which is connected by high roads to another garden city, which eventually has a municipal railway connecting other garden cities, and there is an intermunicipal railway that connects the main city. So, this aspect promoted a lot of suburban formation, but rather being suburbans, this became an urban district as such, which contained a population of 35,000, and this is a self organizing city of its own, which has linkages to the central city. The advantages of it being the city people despatialize into other cities. So, the crowd over here of the central city gets dispersed rather than sacrificing their mutual facilities. So, whatever facility was in the city core is being dispersed here as well, whereas the administrative again is being dispersed and people move towards. So, a person working here in the garden city could live and work here, whereas a person living here could work in a garden city as well, and a good transport or a communication network between these cities create more or establishes more interrelationship between each of those. She even went on to criticize about the wheel radius or the concept of Le Corbusier, where this entire urban environment was monolith in nature. It does not consider human welfare as such. So, Jane Jacobs' point of view was this entire monolith of commercial districts promoted more of just motorways rather than safe or walk friendly neighborhoods, and there was no sense of social or a civic place in these, whereas these was just considered to be concrete jungles where people could not even socialize. Even the podiums that were designed below the buildings were not a sense of social or sense of identical places. So, there is no imageability in a city which is being followed. So, she had a lot of criticisms towards different city concepts that has been promoted by different architects and philosophers, and this was another ideal city concept that was followed in Northern America, where there was again concept of a radiating city, the city beautiful, which encompasses a central landmark place which is dominated by the city skyline. It is composed or juxtaposed of a natural streetscape, and lot of streets radiating itself into different urban neighborhoods and promote, but the scale of the city beautiful was much high in terms of encompassing a culture or a social based composition. So, eventually she led on to have Jane Jacobs' 4 rules of successful urban planning. So, studying about all cities henceforth, she had put down some certain rules of a city which could follow, so that it becomes a beautiful urban district. The first rule of the urban planning of hers was the district should be mixed use in nature. There should not be a particular. So, we had seen about districts in Kevin Lynch that it has a it is homogeneous in nature, which means that Jane Jacobs criticizes the same, saying homogeneity is not the only aspect, but heterogeneity has to be brought in, so that mixed uses could form a much more vibrant neighborhood. One use in a particular city is of no function, but multiple uses could create a sense of vibrancy. The second important rule which was followed was break down the urban blocks, so that a user can connect himself with other neighborhoods as such. The third important thing was the permanency of that urban form could be established by bringing in more people and reducing more roads or highways. So, segregate the urban and highway traffic in an arterial road and make places much safer, flamboyant and more for the public. And the last important thing she was focusing on, design user friendly neighborhoods which has eyes on the street, which means that a person walking on the street has to be should experience the entire neighborhood in a neighborhood form as such, whereas the buildings surrounding the walkways should have an interaction towards the street. So, following this urban planning principles, a particular neighborhood concept could be thriving in those American cities. And she was again very famous for her wrestling with Robert Moses, who was a great builder in America. So, Robert Moses proposed the Washington Square to be demolished and an expressway that is cutting across the city. So, this was very famous in America, where there was a literal fight between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses, where Jane Jacobs was more focused and she wanted to preserve the neighborhoods and encourage mass transit, while Robert Moses was just wanted to build something big, that is including highways. So, the red line which you see was the highway which is proposed, which is cutting across the neighborhood of Washington Square, where the open spaces of the square should be taken out and a bridge of highway should connect one city to another. Now, this city will deprive itself of its use and walkability when this comes, and it is much unsafe for her. So, this is the argument of the death and life of great American cities, where making cities more vulnerable not to the highways, but more in terms of a social, civic and a walkable sense. Moving into the next person or a philosopher, Christopher Alexander, who in his book The Pattern Language and the Timeless Way of Building portrayed different aspects of architecture and different elements of planning in the form of a language. So, he exhibited this entire book, which contains around 253 patterns, on a guideline of designing a building. So, these guidelines could be got in terms of series of diagrams which are represented. So, this could be applied in terms of a larger scale construction of towns as well as smaller scale construction of buildings as such. So, he was particular in. So, this book was just not a book to be read, but it was a resource for making dead places live. So, the characters and the patterns given in the book are much more related in terms of making places and spaces and creating an interaction between these places and people, and how efficient use of these patterns could imply in architecture as well. A pattern language, it was an approach to building and design that understands the human person of being both communal and individual. So, Christopher Alexander again argues that a person is seen as an individual within a house, but a person is seen as a community outside the house. So, how to design towns when he himself sees as a community, and how to design or what are the patterns to be exhibited in a house when he sees himself as individual. So, towns and buildings will not become alive unless they are made by all the people in the society, and unless these people share a common personal language. So, this personal language was derived as pattern language, and drawings exhibit these patterns to be implemented. So, let us just take an example of one of the pattern. So, which he has identified one pattern, which is saying the pattern is nothing but people or the families are becoming nuclear and people are moving towards outside cities or suburbs. So, which means that the problem existent in this pattern or analyzing the pattern was there are lot of nuclear families, there is no social interaction between one family and another, and within the family the interaction gets lowered. So, now the solution to him was create private realms or create individual families which could be clustered around a common space and a communal household. So, when 10 nuclear families or the families of a single entity are clustered around the town either in a building or in the verticality of a building or in different houses in a particular cluster, they could share a common space, they could share a communal household which clustered itself to form. So that they also have a private space for them and they have a communal space in a city. Now, just an example of how to imply it. So, the first, so these are several patterns out of 253 which are projected by him, and out of which a 6-foot balcony is explained here. So, he says that the pattern number 167, which is a 6-foot balcony. So, the problem identified by him was a balcony which is less than 6 feet could not be used properly. So, the support argument for that is if a balcony is not 6 feet wide, a balcony is for a recreational purpose. Within a house, it should accommodate at least 2 or 3 people sitting and chatting for a coffee. So, which means that it could leisurely accommodate 2 or 3 people who can pull down their recliners with a cup of coffee and a table. So, any balcony which is less than 6 feet could not be used eventually. So, for that he gives either a recessed balcony kind of thing. So, he solves the entire through a pattern of balcony application where he says it could be a 6 feet balcony. You do not need to sacrifice the building edge by projecting 6 feet, but rather you could internalize a balcony so that a portion of it comes exterior and a portion of it is semi enclosed. So, the functional purpose of a balcony is also served as well as the aesthetic value of it is added. So, he also comes across with different series of patterns, and the book exhibits a lot of patterns around it, which includes level of scales, strong centers, boundaries, edges, voids, inner calm, not separateness. So, all these are different kinds of terminologies that are used in the book, which creates different urban environments and livelihoods. So, when these patterns are exhibited in a different ways, when we accept that in architecture, it could create a good way of building of towns at a larger scale and buildings in a smaller scale. Moving on to the last part of Italian architect called Aldo Rossi, who had exceptionally created city in form of architecture of a city, the book done by Aldo Rossi, which explains city is composed of different parts, and these different parts are different systems which are put together in the system of a whole. So, in simple words, Aldo Rossi tells that city is understood by collective memories of individual elements which eventually forms a spatial system as a whole. Now, some of the important aspects which Aldo Rossi deals in the book include spatial systems. He conveys to the user or a reader that city is composed of different spatial systems. Lot of colors explain different spatial systems which include residential, commercial, different land uses, and these spatial systems are interrelated through the use of different networks, and these networks are the transport networks. So, which means that these spatial systems are connected or interconnected through the use of different modes of transport and transportational networks. The secondary thing he talks about are primary elements. So, primary elements, what he means is that something which is of permanent and a complete usage in a building or which dominates the skyline of a particular building. He talks about history as a collective memory. A city is understood as a whole when it is composed into parts, and history plays a very important role in understanding a city as a whole. Monument, this also symbolizes history as a collective memory where it focuses, it acts as a landmark, it acts as a place of social environment, it acts as a civic center, or it also marks history or a collective memory of that particular place. In simple words, it symbolizes a city. And another point of genus loci, which is a single central focal point in a particular city which invites people like the Roman Forum Romanum or the Greek Agora or the central places in Citadel, which invites people for public forums. Now, the conclusion of it includes the city and its architecture are inseparable, which means that he tells city is composed of parts and architecture are the parts composing a city. So, these two elements are always inseparable from one another. So, in order to design well and good cities, the architect masters meaning and through it he is able to enter into the process of society's transformation. So, understanding these theories and spaces, applying it into a particular urban design principles creates good environment to live in. Just to summarize things we had studied, so we had looked at these 5 major persons, including Gordon Cullen, Kevin Lynch, Jane Jacobs, and all these concepts of their urban theories. So, these are the some questions to be noted upon, which includes you could talk about mental mapping and all those. So, we would see the issues of urban space globalization in the forthcoming chapter. Thank you.